I could take a nap.
Hello. Hope everyone's had a wonderful time at Gamelab. Thanks for joining us on the final day. My name's Adam Smith from the PC game website Rock Paper Shotgun, but the man you're here to see is Raul Rubio of Tequila Works. Tequila Works made the game Deadlight, which was your first game.
That's correct.
They also worked on the Sexy Brutale, which is an incredibly strange game which we'll talk about, but most recently they released Rime. If you could just tell people who don't know, I assume many people here have probably played Rime, but if you could explain what Rime is and where it came from.
Sure. Well, first of all, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, Adam. And Rime is, in essence, in one line, an evocative experience.
Okay.
And that is obviously the beginning of a far longer explanation of what it is. But one thing that is very important to put in place is that Rime basically is a condensation of many visions or many points of view, okay, into a single vision, and a consequence of how we apply that creativity into, well, this boy in an island trying to reach the tower, right? And, well, it's tough, but one of the consequences of, for example, setting Rhine in the Mediterranean, and that's something that we are as very often, is because, well, it was a very practical setting for us.
Right. So Rime, it's a fantastical world, but it's a world which has elements of your own childhood, your own, well, what you could see outside your window. And I think one of the things we're talking about today is how culture informs games, but also how games tap into universal human culture. And with Rime, there was a point you got to when you realized that your childhood had made it into the game in ways that you didn't even realize.
That's correct. And it's very important to know that, well, Rime has been created by a team, of course.
Right.
So when we're talking about childhood experiences, it's not just a single person's memories. But you're right. I mean, there are moments in the game that, well, are extracted from reality, right? And like the cave or drowning or things like that. But the essential thing is that, well, Rime is essentially a tale, right? It's a fable. Right. And like any story, and in this case, interactive story, is something that is part true, part of it is magnified or fantasized. Right. So you're right. I mean, it's a fantasy world in the sense that it's a world with a new set of rules, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But that's part of, well, the vision to make you feel like a kid.
Yeah,
right.
And it has similarities to Zelda in that sense, which is a nice game to be compared to. I think if people tell you your game's a little like Zelda, you tend to be quite happy. But I think that the origin of Zelda is childhood play, and it's something that we get away from. I think sometimes with games we talk about the deeper experiences, the philosophies in them, but Rime is a game about play to an extent. It's got a darker undercurrent, but it is informed by that idea of exploring and playing and discovering a world.
Well, that's part of the idea of being a child, but also is key because you, the player, you appear in this world, and suddenly there's no reference for you, right? I mean, and we wanted to create a story that moved those emotions, I mean, those human emotions, and try to be as universal as possible, while at the same time, it had to be a personal story for you, right? So that means that essentially we got rid of dialogue, for example, and when you get rid of the language, emotions prevail, right? And that's a big difference with, not only the games we released before, like Deadlight or Sexy Brutale, also it challenges the very idea of what you take for granted in narrative in games, right? In the sense that suddenly, and this is something that we had lots of internal discussions ourselves, is suddenly, instead of being a set of rules that has a story on top of it, the story is the most important element that is driving the whole experience to the point that, for example, the puzzles are conditioned to the narrative and not the opposite, right? And well, I can tell you that it was not easy because, for starters, designers say that that was not the game.
Yeah, yeah. So because one of the games that inspired Rime is Journey, right? So that game company, which is a really weird name to say out loud, that game company made the game Journey, and Rime is partly inspired by that. Now, you told me that when you were starting production on Rime, somebody said, "Oh, but it's not a game," and you said, "Well, it is. Journey was a game." And he was like, "No, that wasn't a game either."
In fact,
which gets us to the very thorny issue of what is a game.
well, that's like what is art, right?
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, no, right. I mean, one programmer said, "Well, this makes no sense. I mean, nobody's going to play this game because this is not a game." It's like, well, the vision says that this is an evocative experience. So it's an experience that is driving emotions just like Journey. And this was like, Journey is not a game. And my answer was like, I don't care. I mean, people don't care if Journey is a game or not. I mean, it's something that you get, well, an emotional response by playing it, right?
Well, I think
that's something that we need to do. I mean, you need to play the game to feel the emotion. So this story is not something like a porn movie. Sorry, I always use this example because John Carmack used it in the first place. So these are not my words. John Carmack said when talking about narrative in games that basically the narrative in games is at the level of a porno movie.
Right.
In the sense that you have action and a story, but not combined together, right? And it's action, story. So something we wanted to challenge is, well, this is an interactive medium. Don't record this. So you should play, I mean, the story, you should experience what this character, this avatar is living because it's you, right? You are projecting into this kid. And, well, the only way to achieve it was by projecting ourselves there. So, coming back to what is a game, and I'm not going to try to answer that question, or what is art, whatever. We talk about creativity, right? And creativity, the way we see it, is some kind of melting pot or alembic that basically everything that defines you, that makes you unique, is there. I mean, any input, like everything you see, everything you hear, everything you eat, that's quite disgusting, is going to be processed in a very slow, steady process, and years later is going to come out. So doesn't matter what you do. I mean, just from the moment you are born to the moment you die, that creative process is always working inside you, right?
So this leads me to the question of, well, two questions. One is, if all the things that you experience are in your head and then they become the things that you create, how do you pick and choose the things, given that we're all here for a limited amount of time, how do you choose the things that are most important, the things that are going to give you most value? This extends to, should games be inspired mostly by games, or should they, and not just films and music, but can a game be inspired by a sunset? I mean...
Okay, answering the first question, you don't. You cannot choose. I mean, it's basically, when I'm eating ham, for example, you're in Spain, so you must eat ham, right, for example. You cannot tell your body, look, process the proteins, don't take the fat.
Ignore the fat,
right? No, you eat everything. So with everything that you perceive, is the same. I mean, your mind, your brain is processing it, and basically it becomes a part of you, right? So most of these elements that make you as a person, as a being, are, well, used later in a way that is not conscious. Like we were mentioning that in Rime, for example, there's this puzzle that is a maze of darkness, right? And I was not aware of that when we were designing it, but then we were testing it, and suddenly I started telling this story when I was a kid, and I got lost in a cave, and I used the flash of a camera to get out, right? And Manu, the designer who was making it, is like, you just described the puzzle.
Yeah.
I was like, I had no idea.
So subconsciously, you are imprinting literal events from your childhood
And
into the game.
that's correct, and that's why it's so important the role of roots, cultural roots in this, because again, it's not only what you perceive by watching TV or playing other games. It's like the others that were before you, the ones who educated you are also projecting those elements of creativity in your brain, right?
And that's where collaboration is important as well, right? So
It's essential.
the more cultural differences we have, and the more different roots we have in our garden, basically, the better the garden becomes. So, to use my terrible metaphor, if you have a diverse set of voices and they're all listened to, then you get a more interesting product.
Yes, that's that's what I believe, and in my experience, that's factual. I mean, that's correct. Because answering your second question, basically comparing games with other games is not how life works. I mean, you probably are going to have in your memory Citizen Kane or War and Peace or Tetris, or that time that you went to Tibet for a spiritual experience, or that day that you spent 48 hours watching TV or whatever, or that, I don't know, taxi strike yesterday. So everything is part of everything, and when you are working in a team, and this is essential when you are creating something like Rime, basically that vision is a unified vision, but is supported by many. To give you an example and some perspective, the Rhine team was around 18 people, 35 at peak, but those people were condensing 11 nationalities, people from, well, Argentina, the US, Japan, the Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, Spain, Portugal, and so on. And, well, basically having this talented group of individuals who have very different origins and beliefs, sexual orientations, basically that enrich it, the vision. Because again, it makes no sense having a guru on the top of a pyramid trying to tell you, yes, follow my vision, this is what needs to be done. And the other's like, yeah, but I don't feel anything. I don't understand why.
Well, this comes down to, I think, something in the games that you've made as well, which is that the player character in a game is often at the top of the pyramid. They're the most important person in the world. They're the person who can save the world. They're the hero. Everything revolves around them. They're the sun in the solar system of the game. But that, I don't think, is true in your games. And we'll go back to Deadlight, because Deadlight is a zombie game, but it's not a typical zombie game.
Not at all. When we were creating Deadlight, and Deadlight was released in 2012, back then, well, the zombie games were games like Dead Rising or
Putting dead in the title was a real mistake.
Dead Island, of course. Every zombie game had to be dead something.
Yeah.
And then we evolved and we got Dying Light. So back then, basically, all the what defined the zombie genre in games was, well, over the top gore and violence and killing in very creative ways and crazy ways.
The Dead Rising, lawnmowers and shears,
things like that. So suddenly we have this game about the story of an average Joe, an everyday man. I mean, a very normal person under extraordinary circumstances, which is the apocalypse, the end of the world, and we are telling the player, well, don't take everything for granted. Challenge what you know about your expectations, and you have to escape and avoid the zombies, right?
So there's a story here about playtesting and an axe, which I'd love for you to tell.
Yes.
How do you teach players that it's not a good idea to kill a zombie? It's better to run away, because I don't know if we're going to see a zombie here, but if a zombie walked into the room now, my instinct would be to run away, but apparently a lot of people would try and kill the zombie.
That's how it work in real life, but not in games, because, again, for ages you have been killing zombies, and you know that killing zombies is good, killing innocent people is bad, right?
Yeah.
And, well, we decided to turn it around. So the main character, Randall, I hope this is not a spoiler because it has been 5 or more years ago.
You're
since
allowed
the
to
release.
spoil your own game, I think.
I guess it's okay. Well, basically, this guy does not differentiate between zombies and the living. He doesn't care because he's a psycho, right? So that's how he survived the apocalypse, because, well, he doesn't care. But the thing is that the player doesn't know that. And again, in the user testing in Europe, many people initially they tried to face the zombies, they failed, and from that moment they avoided the living dead. In Japan, nobody tried to kill the zombies, so they were always very well organized in escaping. But in America, it was a disaster. And this is not a stereotype, I mean, this is for real. We're testing the game, and people were trying to fight the zombies. You cannot even punch or kick in the game. I mean, so they died, and they kept dying, and they kept dying. And was like, what's wrong? It's like, the game is broken. It's like, why? I cannot kill the zombie. It's like, what do you think? You can kill the zombie? Like, well, because it's a zombie game. It's like, but you have no weapons. It's like, oh, okay, I get it.
So now I go and find a weapon, and then
10 minutes later, yes, this guy found an axe,
Go to
a fire
Walmart.
axe. And of course, we built Deadlight, basically trying to highlight what makes a human human and a zombie, which is humans are faster, smarter.
Most of them.
Yeah, that's not Rime, that's not Deadlight, but anyway. And they get tired, right?
That would be a really weird looking zombie game, by the way. I want to play that zombie game.
Don't give me an idea. But zombies, basically, yeah, they may be damp and slow, but they never get tired, right?
Yeah.
So in Deadlight, we had this stamina system, and suddenly, well, this guy had the axe, and he's like, ha ha ha, I'm the master of the universe, and tried to kill the zombies, got tired, and the zombies ate him.
Which was
right?
a bug, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's a glitch.
And again, he was like, hey, it's a glitch because I'm trying to attack and doesn't work. It's like, yeah, but because you are tired. And it's like, what the fuck? What do you mean I'm tired? Like, well, because you are a person and you get tired. I don't get it. And basically, this is an example on how, yeah, maybe we learn from that experience, of course, and you can see in Rime, for example, how we refine what human emotions are, okay? In Deadlight was pretty primal and primitive in the sense that these basic instincts is action, right? But everything was working in different cultures like Europe and Asia, but not
When he
in
tells
the
this
United
story in
States.
America, it's a Spanish guy with the axe, by the way.
Absolutely true, but they can play in America. So the point is, doesn't matter how much you think that people are going to understand it. I mean, one single case of something wrong makes you realize that maybe it's not so universal, right? And that's why, for example, in Rime, we decided to do something that felt truly human, not universal, human. So basically, how we build Rime is something that, well, it can be defined as a fable, okay? And again, there's no dialogue, so it was very convenient, so we didn't have localization. But at the same time, was something that allow us to use symbols and, well, images, right? But on the surface is very Mediterranean. And when we decided to use this setting, it was just a practical consequence of where we are, which is, well, next to the Mediterranean. Right now, well, you go out and you will see the sea, right? So when we're thinking about documentation and field trips, etc., in Deadlight was pretty problematic because it was set in Seattle and, well, the Pacific Northwest. So, yeah, flying there all the time was not that good. So that's why Deadlight, for example, has this photorealistic style, because all the documentation was extracted from Google. So in Rime, we said, well, if we want some references for perspective, we can go to the Oma Forest in the Basque Country, or we can go to the Cathedral Beach in Asturias, or, well, the colors. José Luis Baello, the art director, he's from Elche, he's in Valencia. And For him was, well, how the Mediterranean looks, right?
Whereas to me, a person who lives in Manchester, England, which is mostly grey, I thought this was made up. But it illustrates a serious point, which is that I think
That explains Resistance 2. Yeah.
if you put your own experiences and your own surroundings and your own everyday, ordinary life into a game, to a lot of people it is extraordinary because it isn't their experience.
Absolutely, and that's, again, coming back to how creativity works. That was not something that we made it consciously at the beginning. On the opposite, when we were showing the prototype, the Rime prototype, we basically wanted to show how the mechanics work, not how it look.
Right, right.
And for us, it was very ordinary looking, right? I mean, it's just a kid on a beach, and we have, well, these references from, I mean, they are Indo-European, and they said, oh, you have created something exotic and unique here. It's like, what do you mean by exotic? I mean, this is well, this is the Levante. I mean, this is not pretty exotic at all. But you're right. I mean, for us, something ordinary, filtered by this alembic, this creative alembic, turning into something extraordinary.
And I think
coming back to the beginning, it's not just a fantasy world. It's our interpretation on this fantasy world.
And I think there is a very, very important point here, which is that we too often discount our own experiences and our own cultural roots, to go to the title of the talk here. We assume that they're boring sometimes, and we assume that our lives and our surroundings aren't exciting to people. But actually, if you communicate something of yourself, then that is a thing that you know well, and that knowledge is surprising to people.
Yep, and that's why diversity is so important. Again, because different points of view are going to be able to, well, to give you this fresh perspective that you couldn't. I mean, if all of us think the same way, all of us had these super happy childhood memories of living in a great room for 20 years, watching I Love You, Lucy. Not real case, it's just hypothetical.
This
basically,
is my childhood.
the kind of experiences that you get, well, is probably going to be related to gray spaces and 50s old-fashioned families in the US. But again, when you cannot differentiate what makes the world magical, another person can come and tell you, whoa, this is fantastic. I mean, you manage, for example, to use the negative space of Dalí to use it in puzzles, right? And for you, it was like, yeah, so what? It's like, well, you don't realize how cool is this? And the opposite is also true. I mean, people can stick to the surface and say, oh, yeah, pastel colors, Wind Waker. So a kid, a beach, Wind Waker again. And then you have our technical artist, Pablo, who is Argentinian, and he's like, well, ¿qué boludeces son estas? Because he's like, there's no cell shading in Rime, and the gradients are not hard, and he's like, yeah, people don't realize that. I mean, they don't pay attention to that. But it's like this guy with the fire axe in Deadlight. I mean, you cannot please everyone. No. If, for example, if we try to make the less common denominator and trying to make experience that is appealing to everyone by sticking to the differences, I mean, removing everything that is different, well, the result is pretty damp experiences. So, challenging yourself and sticking true to your vision and finding the common elements to all these, well, audiences is what makes the difference. And you can see that also in Sexy Brutale, for example.
Well, we'll move on to that in a second. I want to talk about the word challenge for a second, because I think that the issue that some, and I'm going to badmouth critics here, bear in mind I am one, so it's a little bit of self-loathing.
How many wars had your last critic?
Oh, I am my own worst critic, which is, but that's important. But when you look at some of the, not negative, but some of the lukewarm reviews for Rime, some of them think it's too challenging, and some of them don't think it's challenging enough. And you think, well, both of those things can't be true, but of course they can, because everyone's experience of the game is different, because it's challenging to you if you struggle with puzzles, but you intentionally made a game that wasn't supposed to be incredibly challenging.
True. First of all, well, believe it or not, we creators, developers, we read the reviews. And again, criticism is very important to self-improve, right? And well, you're right. I mean, some reviews say that the puzzles were frustrating. I still don't know how and why. And some of them say the puzzles are bland and they are not a true challenge. But again, that's something that you take for granted in games, right?
We assume, and
puzzles need to be challenging because games are about competition,
when
right?
somebody says the thing that your coder said, this isn't a game, Journey isn't a game, I think that is often the element that's missing. They think, well, it isn't challenging me. There isn't a test. There isn't something that I need to overcome. And obviously in Rime there is. It's a journey with a lot of challenges, but you don't want people to get blocked along the way.
That's what we were talking about when the designers themselves had to get rid of those barriers of, well, the rules are not the most important thing anymore in the game, the story is. To the point that Kevin, the lead designer, he decided that the puzzles, I mean, we had to lower the difficulty because the puzzles were just a vehicle to drive that narrative. I mean, no more, no less. And that was a very conscious decision, right? And, well, the example could be like, you are suddenly this kid, we are telling you that you are supposed to be behaving like a child, and you are in the middle of the countryside, suddenly you find the door, you get inside, now you are in a dungeon, you cannot escape, you need to solve the puzzle or you will die there. That made no sense for us, right? Because again, with Rime, we wanted to tell you a story from beginning to end, and it was critical that you reached the ending, so all the pieces made sense, right? If we were going to block the player and make the player frustrated, and more importantly, the player couldn't look at all the symbols scattered throughout the game because they were focusing on the gameplay elements, that was bad for us because the narrative wouldn't work.
It becomes a distraction rather than a complement.
But again, if you look at it in terms of game design, every game designer is going to tell you that, well, that's not how games work, right? But we didn't care, just like the guy with the axe.
Yeah, he's a good guy.
I guess so.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a really easy question now. Sum up the Sexy Brutale in one sentence. Has anyone played the Sexy Brutale? It's one of the strangest games I've ever played. We have,
have quite a few.
And yeah, it's a very, very hard game.
Why is it strange
get in a
to
capsule.
you?
Why is it?
Why? Yeah, why is it strange to you?
Okay, so Groundhog Day with murders. Is that does it, right? Does that do it?
Yes.
It's a game with a time loop, but it's also a very strange setting, and it's an isometric doll's house look with grotesque murders in it.
That's correct.
I think that's quite strange.
So, well, what makes the Sexy Brutale more interesting is that in this case, it's a collaboration and a co-production with another studio that again has a very different point of view because it's an English studio. They are based in Guildford, right? So if we had tried to make a very British dark humor game, I can tell you that probably wouldn't be like the Sexy Brutale, right? Because again, we can try to understand it, but the story by Gene Griffiths is super, well, British in a sense that, well...
you can't just imitate somebody else's voice, right?
You cannot imitate that. But, for example, when we were starting the project, the Griffiths brothers and Tom insisted that we had to go to the English countryside and start visiting all these old castles and palaces. Most of them are hotels now or museums, right? So we could absorb the essence of British culture, which is the decadence of an empire that is not aware that their times are gone. Something like that. Not my words. And to the point that we went to Westminster and basically we got the tour in the House of the Commons, so we could basically, we could get to know, and this is really weird, but again, I guess guides are used to everything. Like we were asking stories about, well, ripped carpets, or scratches in the boot.
Right.
It's like, oh, what happened here?
Yeah.
We're like, oh yeah, in 1953, Winston Churchill was drunk and whatever. So that was very important for Cavalier, and at the time we didn't know why. For them it was very important because for them, well, they tried to convey all these gruesome, very, very adult story in an environment that you couldn't take very seriously. And again, that's another example of British essence, in the sense that, well, okay, everything is so fucked up and so dark that you cannot take it seriously at all, right?
No. You have to laugh eventually.
That's why the dollhouse, that's why you pay attention to the environment, is so full of details, because there are many, many elements that are telling a silent story right? So what happened is as important of what is happening in the mansion, right? In this, well, I mean, the Sexy Brutale is literally the name of the casino mansion that was, well, originally a very glamorous mansion, and now, well, it's pretty decadent. It's weird because when we were developing the story with Cavalier, well, we ourselves, I mean, it was so over the top and so full of craziness that for us was just fun. And then when we released the game, we started to watch YouTubers and receiving emails from people who said, look, I couldn't sleep last night. I mean, why did you do that to Tequila? I was like, what do you mean, Tequila? Oh, Tequila Bell, the character. Like, yeah, I mean, that death, that was so cruel. And it's like, well, all of them die every day. I mean, literally, that's a person that is dying every day for years.
This is the way the Sexy Brutale works. It's repetitive deaths. People are literally caught in a loop and they repeatedly die.
Because it's time loop.
And you thought this was funny. No, I mean it is.
Because they are cute. I mean, you have these little characters and with big heads and so chibi, etc., etc. But with Tequila Bell, we realized that well, I mean, some guy said this is so unnecessarily cruel. I mean, she's bleeding to death. Her mother is there talking to her. She's asking for help. Nobody's listening to her. And now that I'm in the middle of the game, every day at 7 p.m., I hear the bell and she's asking for help and I cannot save her. So why did you do that? So we did it for gameplay purposes, of course. But in terms of, well, what the narrative meant is because this is a story about assuming and accepting death and what you left behind. Sorry, I guess this is not a spoiler. No. But accepting death is something that you interest so much that basically when you are playing the day, you start to measure events based on the time of the martyrs, because you always can notice when someone is being murdered, right? So it's strange, but it's something that could only happen with this self-awareness typical of Guilford, and basically our capacity to adapt and absorb this vision that was not our own. And again, that's what differentiates a team effort from a design by committee, which is, well, a team can work as one. Design by committee is like, well, in RoboCop 2, when they are starting putting all these detectives in RoboCop and can do anything, basically.
So I think one of the things that's very interesting.
I think we are too old. They don't know what RoboCop 2 is.
The thing that I find very interesting about the Sexy Brutale, there's lots of things. It's a mechanically fascinating game, and it's a really beautiful game as well, despite being so gruesome. But death in games is usually something that the player is doing to other people.
Yep.
And this is a game where quite often death is happening as a thing that you feel guilt about, that you feel oppressed by, and you feel powerless to stop. That's a very strange way to approach death in a game, but it wouldn't be in a film or in a book. And I think that death is such a fundamental part of games. I mean, the earliest games, you literally had lives. You know, you ran out of lives at the end. You still do in a Mario game, do you? I don't know.
Yep.
It changed so much. But, you know, you'd collect an extra life. You know, you'd run out of lives. And that's a really childish way of thinking about death, because death is a big deal.
Yeah, on one side, you have Dinopathy, who is very vocal about the use of death as a gameplay mechanic. And then, well, on the opposite, you have, creators who challenge the, like Bander was mentioning, that why death, right? I mean, there's no point. It's not improving the gameplay experience for them. But that's because, well, originally the games are a very competitive medium, right? As I said before. Originally, if we go to a space war, basically you are shooting spaceships. In Pong, you are playing tennis. And if we analyze the concept of the real life tennis, the game is basically 2 people or 4 people competing against each other to beat the crap out of them, right? So you extrapolate that again on the surface, the next consequence is that you are shooting people in the head. And that's why
I've never seen a tennis match escalate quite that dramatically.
I'm pretty sure it would be
the point,
good ratings. Yeah.
The competitive aspect does. I mean, the end game of competition is defeat. Is to defeat somebody, and the simplest way to express that is often through murder, through death. And
and when you are exposed to this violence, increasingly more realistic violence, is something that you accept as something natural, right? I mean, if you were shooting aliens in Space Invaders, well, they are just a bunch of pixels, right? So it was a very primitive and simplistic approach to violence. But if you go to the next Call of Duty, whatever, they have more resolution than real life. So the difference is that you still see it as hostile elements, like opponents, right? I have this story about this producer who is, he was a Sony executive. And basically his approach on how to deal with this was curating the games that his children could play, right? So he used, like parents these days, they use the games as a reward because good scores in exams or sports or whatever. But being a game developer, basically he chose the kind of content that they were going to enjoy. And now, they are 13, and basically last month they were playing Mario Kart. They discovered Mario Kart, the good one, in Super Nintendo. Nintendo 64 is also cool. The thing is that for them was marvelous because basically they discovered multiplayer. It was the first multiplayer game they played. We're talking about 2017, right? So for them, until that point, there were single-player experiences that challenged themselves against the machine, but suddenly they had to compete against their own brother, right? And in the case of shooters, the father, basically, he allowed them to play range shooting galleries, which is, basically like shooting Olympic shooting,
targets,
And the second game they could play was Deer Hunter. And
they loved it.
They hated
it. They didn't want to kill the deers.
That was the point. I mean, they were basically 10 years old, and they were like, why I need to shoot the deer?
What's my incentive?
Is innocent, right? That's wrong. And now they don't want to play shooters. So this is very Pavlovian, probably. But the point here is that, it's also responsibility how we manage this kind of contents. And that's part of the creative process as well. Because, I remember that in Japan, when basically in the 90s we had all this murder simulator thing in the West, the answer was very clear. It's like, it's our duty as adults to teach the children the difference between fantasy and reality. It's that simple.
Right? If we haven't done that, we've failed somewhere way back down the line. And we are going to run out of time relatively shortly.
Really?
It's gone very quickly. So I would like to talk a little about what you're working on now, which is a VR game. And
it's a VR thing.
It's a VR thing. Okay, so is this you saying this isn't a game now?
So when we started Tequila, we always wanted to push what narrative meant for games in a very clear direction, right? And again, story should be played because this is a game. And don't make me repeat the example that John Carmack used. In Rime, well, we did a pretty good job, and in Sexy Brutale, Cavalier, well, master something that can really reach you, right? So with the Invisible Hours, we try something different, which is, as you mentioned earlier, in most games, you are the center of the universe. You are on the top of the pyramid, right? You are the most important thing. You are the one, the chosen one. You need to save the universe, rescue the princess, whatever. Sometimes that's cool. I mean, but it's as cool as when you are a kid and you think that this is super fun. Again, this is fun for a while, but after a few attempts, it's not fun anymore. Like explosions, aliens, Transformers 4, whatever. So when you grow up, you start to question yourself, your place in the universe. And this is true for the audience, but also true to creators. So with Invisible Hours, we said, well, what if you are not the center of the universe? You are just a little dot in the sphere that makes reality. So all of these people in this room right now, they are the protagonists of their own lives. More importantly, the people outside this room, they are the protagonists of their own lives, and basically we are extras. We are not even secondary characters. So, and traditionally in adventure games, and this is something you take for granted, all the world is waiting for you. So if this would be a point-and-click adventure, basically this talk wouldn't end until you say thanks for coming, whatever, and you launch a scripted event that makes everyone leave the room, and we go out from that door. That's not how life works. So we decided to create the play, basically taking inspiration in immersive theater, which is, well, when, again, you look at theater for millennia, people have been enjoying theater in a very specific way, which is these people
like you're enjoying this right now. You sit and
you are sitting there, we are on a stage, we are performing, and that's it. In immersive theater, basically what they do is taking these people, now they are on a stage, the stage is not this narrow, it's all the building, right? So we are trying to do something that, unlike a movie, is not linear, and is not created by a director. You are the director, and your perspective is defined.
So you're an observer rather than a participant.
Oh. Yeah, that's true. Unlike an adventure game, the world is not waiting for you. So, to put it simple, imagine that this like then there were none, right? And all these people are going to an island, and there's murder, right? And you have different archetypes, like the detective, the femme fatale, whatever. And now, yes, you are an invisible observer. You are like, well, the rear window, and you are an ever-seeing silent witness that can observe all the truth, right, in real time. So basically, what we want to achieve by putting you inside the story is that, well, maybe you decide that the detective is not very good.
Right.
Or maybe you're ignoring all these actors here, you go out that way, and you realize that this could be a sci-fi story because, well, there are, I don't know, killer cyborgs out there or whatever. Or maybe it's a romantic comedy because some people are having fun in the toilets. So why not? So that basically what we're trying to achieve here, please forget about the toilets, what we're trying to achieve here is challenging what you take for granted again in a story.
Yes.
What if I can define the truth based on what I see?
And I am now going to decide that this story is a point-and-click adventure, and we've just solved the puzzle because we got to exit stage left. Thank you all for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it. And
thanks for coming.